So, Capcom in the early aughts was absolutely pumping out Mega Man games. Like I mentioned in my last video covering Mega Man X, the rest of the Mega Man series saw tons of games coming out in just a few years. Likely due to the success of sub-series on the Game Boy, like Battle Network and Mega Man Zero, Mega Man games in multiple series were being released simultaneously per year. Between 2000 to 2004, over a dozen Mega Man games were published by Capcom. There was so much Mega Man content that we would also get some interesting spin-off titles. Command Mission is a full-blown JRPG built into the core of the Mega Man X series. The plot of the game is functionally a spin-off, but it fits well into the time between Mega Man X7 and X8. Some developer interviews that I read were speaking about how the original games informed the combat, level structure, and other aspects of this game. I know it's an overused term, but if you ask me, X Command Mission is an honest, forgotten gem. Considering the concept and IP, it's an incredibly unique game. Of course, it would be a little disingenuous to compare this to huge blockbuster games like Final Fantasy, but being a Mega Man RPG, I think it succeeds in a lot of ways. Especially when you look at the thin list of GameCube RPGs, this absolutely does stand out. I'm a big fan of this game, and I'd love to introduce it to you, so let's take a good hard look at Mega Man X Command Mission. This is going to be a long one, so let's just get right into it. High-ranking Maverick hunters, basically robot police, X, Zero, and a newcomer named Shadow, have been deployed to a nearby region where an asteroid made contact. Some time ago, this asteroid contained materials to make something called Force Metal, a special element that can increase the power and intellect in Reploids like X. The development of Force Metal led to the creation of Giga City, a set of man-made islands in the middle of the ocean where the meteorite landed. The Maverick Hunters are dispatched by this guy named Colonel Redips to check things out, since a bunch of evil Mavericks have begun to congregate and form a rebellion army. Their leader, Epsilon, wants Reploids to use the Force Metal to advance beyond what is currently capable and to completely replace humans once and for all. For the record, humans still exist in this world, but the developer interview I read mentioned that they purposely removed them from this game. I suppose they were all evacuated due to the uprising. Thus far, it's a pretty standard setup for an X game. Right as they begin the mission, X and Zero soon get cut off from each other, and the game begins. I really like how the game's tutorial really just drops you right into the action, and instead just tells you relevant information as it comes up. Unfortunately though, one of the most common criticisms I hear toward this game shows its face right away. Let's talk about the random encounters. These things are a JRPG staple, so it shouldn't be too surprising to see them in this game. The encounter system feels like it's truly random here. There seems to be no sort of bell curve for frequency, and at times it can feel like you're being completely overwhelmed by a fight immediately occurring right after another one. You could walk from one end of a hallway with no encounters, but do it again and run into 3 enemy encounters. On one hand, the actual combat isn't too bad for me, and I actually enjoy it quite a bit. But on the other hand, I can see how people would get frustrated by getting caught right as they're trying to do something important. The level design here tends to lean on the linear side, sort of like a Mega Man game. So the frequent backtracking through long corridors can make the problem even worse. Thankfully, you can run from most enemies pretty easily. Right from the beginning of the game, I never really had any trouble getting away from a fight that I didn't want to do.
Fall back for now!
Fans of the series probably noticed early on that X has had a complete redesign here. Mega Man X, unlike his co-leads in the series, Zero and Axel, received an update to his look with some new gold accents and highlights. X sports this nifty little hologram scarf that I honestly think looks really cool, even though you can only see it when walking around and in a few other places. The artwork of this design from the mobile game X Dive really shows off the design well. There are actually some development images of X in his original armor, but it looks pretty rough. Seems that the armor was, rightly so, changed into a new design later into development. As we make our way up the tower, we're kept in contact with Zero and Shadow via a radio. After finding these pods that once held Epsilon and his cronies, the situation seems a bit more dangerous than they originally thought, and X and Zero try to meet up at a higher floor. X catches up to Zero, but their reunion is cut short by the first boss of the game, which by the way has the amazing name of Hippopressor. Hip oppressor or hippopressor? I'm thinking the latter. I think this is a good time to go over the turn-based combat. It's safe to say that Command Mission borrows a suspicious amount from Final Fantasy X. Command Mission has a very similar turn structure, with a board that displays what characters are coming next in order. And it also shares the combat system with 3 characters out at a time. I won't be one to say that a game can't be a bit derivative, especially if it attempts to have its own spin on an idea. It's not like turn-based JRPGs are a very original concept anyway. It's a funny story here actually. I grew up with a GameCube as opposed to a PS2 or Xbox, and Final Fantasy X completely passed me by. So the first time I was at a friend's house and he just happened to be playing Final Fantasy X, I was like, whoa, this looks exactly like Command Mission. In combat, your characters have quite a few options. In one turn, you can attack, defend, or use an item, and a few other things. When you're attacking, you can use 1, 2, or both of your sub-weapons, which are equipment that you get throughout the game. All characters can use most of the sub-weapons, but some have unique ones designed just for them. Every sub-weapon has a specific ability and a weapon energy requirement, but they almost all come down to missiles and buffs. Every turn you gain about 25% of your weapon energy with a max of 100%. If it's over 50%, you can use your character's special ability called an action trigger.
Charge shot! Now! Yeah!
X's charge shot can use anywhere from 1 to 100% of your weapon energy and attacks every enemy on the field at once. Being the main character, X is an all-rounder. When it comes to defending, I originally thought that it was a bit of a waste of time, but you can actually get to your next turn a bit faster and build up some weapon energy, along with, of course, preventing status effects and the usual damage reduction. A pretty notable aspect of the combat in X Command Mission is that there aren't really any potions or restoring abilities. Instead, you have to rely on a set of sub-tanks, which are straight from the main series, that can be refilled and used as percentage-based healing. This aspect changes a bit how you interact with items. In a typical RPG, you'd stock up on potions and maybe rely on some early game healing spells, but you really can't do that here. You can also turn on your character's specific hyper mode before any action, which changes based on the party member. X gains his X fire armor, which increases his stats and changes his attacks into melee. Charge shot turns into a powerful single target attack, and if you use it at the right time, it can absolutely melt some enemies. Zero, you can imagine, is a bit better at nailing down single targets. His hyper mode is Black Zero, where he gains his special armor color from the main series, as well as boosting his stats. For his action trigger, Zero goes into a time attack based on how much energy you have, and you can enter as many Street Fighter style inputs as you can, and you'll do them all at once on a single target. If you can get 6 or more of these Dragon Punch inputs out, you'll be doing loads of damage.
Take this!
X and Zero's special action triggers are used for very different purposes. So typically, I like to run games on original hardware, but I've always been a fan of this game's art style, and I really want to show it off here. From here on out, I'm going to be playing through the game via Dolphin to get those crispy clean, cel-shaded edges. I'm also playing the European version, since for some reason this is the only version to support widescreen codes. There may be some small changes to the gameplay, but I didn't notice anything. Other than some aging face animations, I think the game looks absolutely glorious in widescreen and at a higher resolution. Of course, running the original game on GameCube looks just fine too, but I felt like the art style really pops with this increase in resolution. Before I forget, Command Mission also released on PS2. That version I think has a demo for the then upcoming X8, which the GameCube version doesn't have. But on the other hand, the GameCube version has a few exclusive collectibles that you can unlock by linking up with the Game Boy Advance. The GameCube's smaller discs also meant for faster loading times, which in this game I think is a big bonus. I have heard rumors that the PS2 version has a lower encounter rate, but the GameCube version is the only one I've known, so I'm sticking with it.
Go down!
The hippo is down, and so X and Zero rush upstairs and confront Epsilon. Somehow, Shadow has betrayed them. How could this mysterious guy that they don't know do this? With a name like Shadow, I never would have thought it against him.
Zero, behind you! Zero! Ah!
Of course, Zero dies again. X makes his escape, and that wraps up the first chapter. Sometime later, X wakes up in a bed and finds that he was rescued by some Reploids and taken to New Hope, the center of the region and the main population center of Giga City. X finds his way through the city and then runs into this bounty hunter named Spider.
Who are you?
Trust me, I didn't do that for you.
Spider has been hired by this rebellion guy named Django, who's trying to take over the place. Of course, he wants X dead, and they get into a fight.
You're pretty good.
By now, you might have noticed the stilted animation and dialogue. And while I think most of the actors are trying their best here, the dialogue and animation cuts their work a bit short. Many times throughout the game, you'll encounter some really meaningful plot developments, only to have them stifled by a poor delivery method. I really do think that there are some really great moments here. With a modern direction and a bit more screen time, these moments could make a real impact. For example, as X makes his way through New Hope, he runs into this character named Aile. Aile shows up to help X, and he says that he believes in what he's fighting for, and that the rebels are doing something wrong. He seems like he's some sort of permanently damaged Reploid with a backstory to share. But before X even gets a word in, Aile is shoving him out of a door, passing him his badge, and then blowing himself up to prevent more robots from chasing X. The way the story beats are handed to the player ends up making the plot, despite some solid bones, appear contrived and often just unearned. I want to know more about this guy, but I'm just not given that time. Through this entire game, you're going to have to give it some leeway in the story presentation.
You have to help Chief R. Aile!
As you go through the level, you see a lot more of these Prions. Prions make up a lot of the standard enemies in this game, and they're all built by the Rebellion. I actually really like their design. Something about it feels like a really good catch-all design for the X series. See, the payoff here with Spider is kinda cool, but really undeserved. He happens to see the badge that Aile gave you, and decides that if his old buddy Aile thinks X is cool, then he must be.
Sorry, Django, but I'm through with this job.
Spider decides to betray Django and hold off some robots, while X makes his way up the tower. This whole segment has been about saving this guy named Chief R, who I believe was originally the leader of this whole base, but I might be wrong. This guy has got a great design. I specifically love the goofy robot parrot that literally does nothing. Like, the parrot is just there. It doesn't make any noise. He doesn't mention it. Nobody even talks about this thing. What were the humans that built Chief R thinking? Like, oh yeah, this robot should definitely have a parrot permanently attached to his shoulder. Anyway, once you finish climbing up the tower, Django gets mad and threatens to blow up the whole place. You do a Metroid-style bomb sequence, running outside to deal with the guy as soon as possible. Throughout the missions, a lot of these little mini-challenges will show up, but they're pretty inconsequential. When you get to the fight, Spider joins to help you out.
Back off if you know what's good for you.
You don't know when to give up, do you? Fine. I'll make short work of you both!
I think in general, it's hard not to like the guy. He's designed to be a gambler with a cool guy fedora and a roguish attitude. In combat, he plays like a rogue thief type, shooting cards with higher speed than X, but doing less damage. His character action has him drawing a set of cards that you can reshuffle once in order to get the best hand. Better hands do more damage or other special effects, and the odds of getting good cards increases with his energy. When Spider enters hyper mode, he turns invisible and becomes immune to all damage and healing, but I didn't really use it here. Elemental types start showing up here as well. Django is an electric type Jaguar. Fire is good on electric is good on water, and water is good on fire. Ice sorta gets lumped in with water here. It's a bit of a bog standard element wheel, but it gets the job done. For the early sections, you just want the newest weapon, and it'll probably be the best at giving you the correct element you need, but there is more thought to it later on. Typically, I'm not a huge fan of elemental systems when they're handled in ways like this. It makes a lot of the bosses in the game feel like it's more about just fighting at once, losing, and preparing, and so you end up just sort of having to search through your equipment and reset. Luckily, X's action trigger adds the fire element to his weapon. With a bit of X fire and a last hit from Spider, Django goes down pretty easily. Spider then joins the party as your first actual party member. Now that the base at New Hope is cleared up, we have some time to explore. The city is functionally a hub. No fights appear anymore, and you can visit some shops and speak to NPCs. I'm definitely going to need some things for the next dungeon, so I bought them here. When I was a lot younger, I would basically never talk to NPCs in games like these. Maybe I just have more respect for the work that goes into these things now, or maybe I'm just more motivated to read. Since this area was originally a level that you play through, there are some really long stretches of nothingness if you decide to go to past areas. I kind of wish they just blocked these off, because at one point I walked all the way down a hallway just to check it out and was left with nothing. I wasted about 10 minutes walking around for basically no reason. Okay, let's start the next mission. So the whole idea is that Nana, an operator, is being stuck in a prison camp and needs to be rescued by X and Spider. Right when you enter the camp, you're introduced to Massimo. Spider mentions that he's heard of Steel Massimo, a well-known hero that's been fighting back the rebellion. Massimo has such an awesome design. I love the armor and the cool dragon aesthetic, but it seems the man in the suit isn't really who he says he is. From the get-go, Massimo starts 10 levels behind at level 1. Thankfully, the experience system in Command Mission rubber bands pretty hard, so he caught up quickly. As you could probably tell, Massimo in combat is a classic tank. He can counterattacks with his unique Force Metal Massimo Plus and has the highest base health of any unit. His standard damage is also pretty high, but it's only one attack and his speed is pretty low. His action trigger has you mashing the face buttons to charge a big laser. A increases the damage and B increases the odds of applying status effects.
Stay down!
His hybrid mode is Glint Armor, which I think increases his stats and odds of countering, but it's hard to tell. I'm always a fan of big tanky characters in games like this. I think there's something about doing a big hit all at once that's really satisfying. Massimo early on feels like a bit of a waste of time, but as you gain party members, I feel like he becomes more useful. The prison camp is underwater, so all the enemies are water themed. You've only got a few sub-tanks at this point, and some enemies can really cut down your health. It does make me wish that there was a more consistent healing source. I kinda knew it was coming here, so I picked up some water armor on the way in, and that really helped out. Now that we have 3 party members, we can also start doing final strikes. Final strikes happen if you do enough damage in one turn to stagger the enemy and bring them low enough in health. When it triggers, you can press A and then go to town on them with all of your party members. Final strikes don't just do a ton of damage though. They also give you 25% weapon energy for your next turn, so it can be useful when dealing with multiple enemies in one fight. My main issue with this idea is that you can't customize the strikes in any way. You'll always have the same missiles and the same standard attacks, and there isn't really any skill or expression to it.
Here we go! Final strike!
You sort of just end up doing it for damage sake, and then you just stop mashing the buttons. Most of the time, the enemies are basically dead anyways. Final strikes really could have just been broken down into a special bonus attack that you do if you do enough damage. The prison is a long series of long yellow hallways without much going on besides the early stealth section. At first, it feels like a maze, and then it literally becomes a maze. The random encounters aren't so great when you have to run back to get an item, but I do like some of the enemies here. This big shark enemy has a hilariously long attack animation. It feels like it was on purpose. That was fun, right? After a moment, you find the operator Nana strapped into this big chair. Nana's left in a pretty rough state here, but with her safe, we can move on to the last section of the camp. As you've been going through, you've been going deeper and deeper underwater through these elevators. I think the idea is really cool that there's this underwater prison, but for some reason, I think when I first played the game, it didn't occur to me that this was underwater at all. It's just dark outside, and you can't really tell where anything is or what you're even really looking at. The only sign that you're actually underwater is the water-themed enemies, and maybe you'll get a glimpse of some sort of aquatic robot outside. X then gets to play with some Fisher-Price toys on the floor. The puzzles in this game aren't necessarily complicated, but I don't know. Moving on, we get closer to the boss chamber. Massimo splits off at one point, and you see a cutscene where he finds the real Steel Massimo, chained up and dying in prison. If you ask me, it's a really cool plot point. I love the idea that this cowardly Reploid got stuck into this armor as a way to hide. Plus, the original Massimo in his prime looked pretty badass. The original Massimo gives him the armor and permission to become the new Steel Massimo. With a bit of encouragement, we move on to the boss. The boss in this chapter is Silverhorn, a giant Triceratops guy. He's been appearing in cutscenes through the chapter, and he seems like a pretty threatening villain. He taunts Massimo, calling him weak, but it's so weird. I remembered this cutscene being so much more intense than it is. I still think it's a cool lead into the fight. The idea is there.
Feeble Massimo? Feeble Massimo! You son of a!
If you were playing the game for the first time, I think this boss could be a bit of a skill check. If you aren't prepared with the right elemental armor and weapons, you can have a hard time trying to do enough damage. This wasn't really the case this time. I was more than well prepared. I also really love his voice lines. For some reason, Silverhorn's voice lines are just lodged into my brain, and I can't get them out. Still, it's a fun boss, and I even got a final strike off on him, which is pretty satisfying. Of course, after all is said and done, Massimo decides to join us as a permanent party member, and the gang returns to base. Rescuing Nana means we have an operator again, like Aile in the original series. Operators help manage the teleporters and communications in the base, and they've been a long-running part of the series. Despite this, they only really have a part to play in the last two games, Command Mission and X8. X decides that they need to continue to build up the team and look to rescue Professor Godil. Nana being around lets us access a few things, like the Sky Room and the deployment menu. In the deployment menu, you can remotely send out mechs that you can find in dungeons to do quests. Each robot has its own stats and are more suited to certain types of missions. While you can get some rare equipment from this, for the most part, this side quest just earns you collectibles for the Sky Room. Not to be confused with the Sky Rim. The Sky Room is a physical bonuses menu. You can listen to music, look through stats, and view bonus content like sketches. You can also unlock new colors for X's scarf and put them on here. I only have the option between red and blue, so I set it to blue. I always saw it more as a cape thing, but I guess it's a scarf. After that, I pretty much went straight into the next chapter. I felt a bit like Spider was falling behind here damage-wise. His damage is a lot lower than the rest of the group, but it's not really like I have an option now. The level design in Command Mission is really just playing with what it has. You dash over some pads on the ground to prevent getting into more fights. Command Mission is sort of like a comfort game for me. Going through each encounter is just complex enough to get a bit of a flow state going as you move through the dungeons, leveling and managing equipment as you go. The enemies here do interrupt that feeling a bit though. The mosquito robots are complete wastes of time with their high evasion, and some enemies here poison you. Unlike in some other games, there's no spells or abilities to save on items if you want to cure poison. No spells or abilities can save you from status effects, and the only other way to get rid of them is to level up. Because of this, status effects can be a bit of a frustration. Some of them don't carry on outside of combat, but the ones that do feel like they're just there to make you suffer. With money being the only way to remove them, it feels like a bit of a waste. Meteors appear here. They're a long-running enemy in the series, and probably one of the most famous Mega Man enemies. They have loads of defense here. You can only get them out of their shell with Massimo, but if their turn is right after his, they return straight to their defense pose. The Meteors play around with the game's two main attack types. All characters have a single power stat, but their weapon determines what type of damage is dealt. The game refers to it as either C or S damage. I assume C stands for close or combat, and S stands for shot. C is melee and S is long range. Since the Meteor blocks from S, Spider and X can't break its stance, and you need Massimo's C melee damage to flip them over. C damage tends to have a higher output, but struggles to hit flying enemies. When enemies attack, they also do C or S damage. But unlike when you're attacking, the defense stats are split between armor and shield, for C and S respectively. I'll probably be referring to C as combat and S as shot for the majority of the video, from this point on.
Need more power.
After some fighting, you run into evil robot Squidward, and he isn't very nice. He wants to find the force metal generator, which the professor here had been researching. I kinda love how much of a freak this guy is, and honestly so far, all of the boss designs have been really great. You can definitely see these guys having classic ex-boss names like Electro Jaguar, Surf Triceratops, or Mind Squid. Speaking of force metal, I forgot to mention how that works. There isn't any traditional armor in Command Mission. Throughout the game, your main customization for a character happens through the force metals that you equip. Force metal can be simple stat upgrades or have higher impact abilities such as X's unique metal, X Heart, which automatically revives him on his first death in a fight. Every metal also has a level of erosion, which can't be exceeded or the character will start having errors. This can be things like losing weapon energy every turn. All the characters gain a certain amount of tolerance per level, and they all have a set number of slots as well. X has 4 force metal slots, while Massimo is stuck with 2. That's kind of a weird thing with Massimo. You pretty much always have to include Massimo Plus, meaning you basically only have 1 force metal slot for him. As the game goes on, more interesting metals show up, letting you have some fun and create some strategies. But for now, raw stats are kinda just the way to go. So in total, when it comes to equipment, you can change your character's weapon, 2 sub-weapons, and 2 to 4 medals. Later on, the gang finds the professor and has to rush ahead to get the force metal generator. This chapter, you're introduced to not 1, but 2 party members, Marino and Cinnamon. Marino is the classic ninja rogue type, and Cinnamon is this game's medic. Cinnamon is revealed to be the generator herself, and Marino is here to kidnap her and make a quick buck.
Whoa. So, I guess I have to steal you then.
The last section of the level breaks off into 2 sections, hard and easy paths. I figured it would be okay to follow the hard path, and after the first 3 fights, it felt like I was right. But these rooms are deceptive. In this fight against 4 robots, I got completely messed up and barely made it out alive. After all that, I was way too hurt to even continue. I ended up so understocked on items, I had to reset and go back and buy more stuff at the hub. This is sort of an unfortunate consequence of playing a game with such linear level design. There aren't really any checkpoints, so when I returned to the level, I had to start from way in the back of the level and make my way to where I was. I just didn't want to waste any of those sub-tanks because I knew that the boss was coming up. You end up finding Marino on the ground by herself. I think it's kind of funny how she introduces herself as Marino the Petty Thief. I mean, that's certainly a way to introduce yourself. After Dr. Psyche, Robot Squidward, beat her up, she wants to get some payback and joins the party. With Marino as a new party member, you can head into the boss fight with Dr. Psyche. His main attack involves summoning these needle enemies that attack you if you don't clear them out. It's pretty fun to wipe them out with a big charge shot, and then finish them all off with the final strike. This fight gives Marino a chance to get to work too. If Spider is the rogue, Marino is the true thief. She has a high speed and deals multiple hits of combat damage with her beam swords. Her hyper mode is by far her best trait, but I didn't really take advantage of it enough. She can get disgustingly fast when she uses Quicksilver. At some points, she could be the only person getting a turn on the board. You don't need defense or evasion if your enemy just doesn't get a turn. Unfortunately, my praise doesn't really apply to her action trigger. Marino pulls up a slot machine that you can manually stop one at a time, but I couldn't get anything to come out consistently with this ability. Even at max weapon energy where it slows down, it was so hard for me to land any sort of attack. Odds are that you could have done more damage by just using her weapon energy on missiles and regular attacks.
We scientists have a nasty bite!
It turns out Dr. Psyche is a two-phase boss. I really love his Nautilus design, super imposing if you don't know what to expect. He flips a core open and closed, which can be a bit tough to manage with. After a while, it felt like it was meant to just make the fight last longer than it needed to.
My life's work!
After the boss, Cinnamon decides to join X and convinces Marino to stay, bringing our total group up to 5 characters. So far, I actually really like the group of characters that X Command mission gives you. Professor Gaudiel also decides to come along.
I knew you had a good heart. That's why I let you kidnap me.
Oh, shucks.
Welcome on board, Marino.
You're connected. Go ahead, X.
At the start of Chapter 5, X and the team try to get in contact with Home Base and Colonel Redops. God, I would kill for some emotional poses or something. Before the communication cuts out though, Redops mentions that Zero is still around. Throughout the series, Zero likes to get killed off, but he likes hiding and repairing himself that much more. The gang decides to help X find his buddy over in a Reploid production factory, where he was last seen. Cinnamon being a part of the team means that we can now use her as a force metal generator. It's a rudimentary crafting system, but I do have some issues with it in execution. First of all, a lot of force metals are tied to Cinnamon's level, so a lot of the time you can't even tell what it is that you would be crafting or working towards. Also, it doesn't really count equipment that you have on a character in the tally, so you can't even really tell if you have what you need or not. Most of the time you would want to be upgrading a force metal that you currently have equipped, but you can't tell if you even have it or not. Last of all, the items that you can collect to permanently increase stats are part of a lot of higher level metal recipes. That means that instead of upgrading the character's stats like you would assume to use it for, you might have to hold on to them to make some metal. At this point, I had already wasted quite a number of these stat upgrades on my characters, instead of using them to create some good force metal. In theory, it creates a bit of a decision to be made by the player here, but I don't think that really comes across. It's too bad that in the end, the generator is more of just a distracting little notification box in your menu. Most of the time, you can try to steal force metals from enemies with Marino or Spider, or just buy them the next time the shop upgrades. While the generator is a bit lacking, having Cinnamon means that the group has its healer. While she starts at a low level like Massimo, Cinnamon quickly catches up and finds a role as a debuffer and healer. Her default combat attack doesn't really tend to do much damage, but you can unlock some weapons that do status effects along with the attack. I kinda love how they animated her attack. It's like she just waddles up, slaps them, and walks away. Her action trigger has you spinning the right stick as much as possible in the time limit. As you turn the stick, hearts increase up to a total of 10. Based on how many hearts you collect while spinning the stick, Cinnamon will heal your party for a certain amount. The detection for the stick rotation is pretty tight. Even a small amount of movement off of a full rotation isn't really counted here. Most of the time I could get 4 to 5 hearts and about 30 to 50% healing out of 50% weapon energy. As time goes on, this becomes a very consistent way to keep your party in a level without having to backtrack and get more items. Her hyper mode is called Iron Maiden. I'm pretty sure it just raises her stats and causes her to block automatically. Cinnamon is really good. She makes running through levels so much easier, and having a consistent recovery ability means that you won't be using up those precious sub-tanks. You're going to be seeing a lot more Cinnamon as the game goes on. One cool thing I love in games like this is when the enemies have little quirks. This medic enemy here surrendered and healed me after wiping out the other enemies. It even uses an attack just called Thanks and disappears if you don't finish it off. The medics drop these syringe weapons for Cinnamon, so we cut her arms off and replace her hands with giant needles. Afterward, we meet Axel, who's been looking for the origin of his shapeshifting ability. Back in X7, Axel's whole shtick was that he was a shapeshifter that could copy the shape and design of other Reploids. It's interesting to see how the Force Metal relates back to Axel. Since he's a new generation of Reploid, it's an excuse to get him back in the party. Axel is somewhat of an all-rounder like X is. He has access to double-shot dual pistols or single-shot strong pistols, and his functionality is very similar to X, but with a few caveats. His hyper mode is virtually identical to Spider's, having a short duration of stealthy invincibility. Axel's most unique feature is that he can transform into half of the robots that you face in the game, specifically the robot mastery types. When you use his action trigger, each transformation is set on a grid of inputs and you press the buttons in time to activate the one you want. At the moment, I have access to Django and Silverhorn, so Axel ends up being a solid elemental damage dealer. The following conveyor belt section feels like the game's first attempt at a full puzzle, but even still, it's really simple. But at last, we finally get to catch up to Zero, who's just shred a whole heap of Reploids. It's honestly a little brutal and kind of leads into Zero's origin. X shows up just in time to save Zero, but the evil Pigeon Man gets away, and the gang follows suit. When you get to this point, it's hard not to use Zero and Axel. It's difficult to compete for party space against three of the main characters from the original series. I'd like to use Massimo, Cinnamon, or Spider, but comparing them to these established characters isn't very easy, and I genuinely like the rest of the cast for what it's worth. But Zero and Axel aren't just strong party members, they almost entirely steal the spotlight after their introduction.
All the class-ass hunters together again. May as well just beg us for mercy.
It's unfortunate, and honestly one of my biggest gripes with the story and command mission. As time goes on, the other four heroes feel like hired help, and only pitch in when it's specifically relevant to them. The boss here felt like the best one so far. My strategy was working perfectly, and it was just difficult enough to keep me on my feet. I wanted to start the fight with the main trio, but soon realized Zero wasn't going to be much help against the flying boss, especially if I keep messing up these inputs. Swapping characters came in handy. Command Mission lets you swap to any party member at the start of a turn. The only real expense is that you waste a bit of weapon energy. Having Spider use his hyper mode, then swapping over to Axel, felt a bit silly, but it meant that I always had one guy safe. What was this guy's name again? Fire Pigeon is down, but he ends up sending a wave of robots on you before he dies. This is a fun segment. I kind of liked having to tear through all these enemies one by one, but afterward Axel uses his transformation to pretend to be the Chicken Man and shut it down. Wrapping up Chapter 5.
You've gotta be kidding. These are your friends? They're the dregs of Giga City.
Honestly, Zero leaving here feels a bit mishandled. On one hand, it does make sense. After all, the party consists of a bounty hunter, a cowardly hero, a self-proclaimed petty thief, and a nurse. He's pretty justified in thinking that they might not be able to handle this or be traitors. Especially since he just got betrayed by another person that was from Giga City. But realistically, it's just an excuse to keep the fan favorite from the party a little bit longer. After that, Redips sends X and the crew off to a secret research lab run by the Rebellion. But it looks like Nana needs to find a way to teleport the gang to the base, so we have some time to explore.
I don't know, man. You've been seeming sus lately.
Hey, X. Something up?
Don't lie to me, Walt! You sussy baka!
Spider's looking a little bit sketchy here, but X doesn't seem to care. After a bit of prep, I set off to the next mission. The Gamala mine is generally straightforward compared to the last area. There's all these rocks that clearly look like objects to be broken, and after you go on long enough, you find these boar car enemies from X2. I think they're from X2. The boars are hilarious in the fight, maybe unintentionally. Something about them growing in size and then freaking out and driving straight at you honestly kind of made me laugh.
Oh, shoot!
After you beat them, though, you get an upgrade to your overworld dash. This whole time, you've been able to press the X button in order to dash and get a little bit more speed. Now, it's blue and it matches my scarf. X can also break those rocks now. Shadow returns. He comes back to fight X, fully explaining something that was clearly a secret research project.
I suppose you came here hoping to find the Supra Force medal. What's that?
Shadow is honestly a bit of an idiot.
I'll tear all of you to little pieces.
It's a bit of a shame that Shadow sort of just comes and goes. It felt like he was supposed to be your main rival throughout the game, but his arc as an antagonist really just starts and ends at this moment. It's sort of like if your rival in Pokemon just fought you once at the start, once at the third badge, and then never again. And of course, Shadow returning means that Zero shows up right away and comes back to the party. It seems like Zero's only reason for leaving was that he wanted to find Shadow and put him down. The fight starts with Zero back in the party. It's good to have him. Shadow gave me some trouble at first, but he's a solid fight. Another fun boss down. In one last shot, Shadow tries to blast Zero, but Spider comes in to block it. Zero sees this and has a complete change of heart. I understand what they're going for here, but Zero was just having a problem with all of these people, and suddenly having one of them take a bullet for him means that they're good guys. Following that, you do a short puzzle with these colored pickaxes. Before I got there, I sort of went the wrong way, so I ended up seeing all these mining robots with malfunctions, so I had them in mind when I was given the colored pickaxe. It's a simple trade puzzle to match the colors up and then move toward the boss, but I thought it was fun. The Chapter 6 boss, Incentus, was the first boss I had difficulty with. I should have figured he would have been based on elements after having a hard time with all these little mini-bosses early on. The game literally gives you elemental armor of every type before the boss, and I just didn't take the hint. I got wiped out and I had to reset.
Unbelievable!
Incentus's gimmick is that he swaps elements every turn, so it can be easy to accidentally heal him with X-Fire or other elemental damage. I found it best to just lean on Zero and keep him alive. Honestly, as time goes on, it feels like 16 uppercuts from Zero can solve anything.
You can't run away!
After the fight, Incentus sets up a bomb to blow up the whole place and traps everyone inside. Spider just grabs the guy and shoves him into a door, blowing himself up and Incentus along the way. After seeing this, Zero completely changes his mind and he decides to stay with the group for the rest of the game. At this point, Spider is permanently gone. After Spider sacrifices himself, you're left with the final set of 6 party members. It's a good time to talk about the party as a whole. I think Spider really made an impact and added a lot to the party, in terms of character variety. Other than him, the rest of the crew is pretty clean cut. Massimo, X, Zero, Axel, and Cinnamon are all pretty nice people, and Marino does have some sort of history of being a criminal, but it's clear that she's not really doing it for all the wrong reasons. Gameplay-wise, the cast is built up pretty well to handle Spider's permanent death. While I do think he's got a cool design and an interesting action trigger, he's clearly meant to be replaced by Marino and Axel. Marino has the whole item theft speed thing covered, and Axel's even got the exact same hyper mode. Speaking of them all as a whole, I think the art design team did a great job of creating a cast of likable characters that all stand out amongst each other. With Spider out of the picture, each character uses a major armor color. X is blue, Marino is pink, Massimo is green, and so on. Even though some of the characters don't get the screen time they deserve, I could definitely see some of these new characters being somebody's favorite. If I had to pick my own personal favorite, it would have to be Massimo. I think his design is just a lot of fun. X and the crew need to deal with some radio jammers, since they can't reach the Colonel anymore. In the deployment center, I unlocked a new color for my scarf, so now I have a green one. I should have mentioned it earlier, but there's also these figures that you can collect by spending tokens at this machine in the hub. The GameCube version has some exclusive figures that can be only earned through a Game Boy Advance connected to the GameCube. If you connect your GBA to the GameCube while on a mission, you can see glowing orbs on the Game Boy screen and track special tokens that are spent on special GameCube-only figures. It's a bit dumb, but loads of games would have these really unnecessary Game Boy link cable bonuses. Nowadays, I'm kinda just glad that it doesn't make me lose out on any major content. This level takes the gang out to the Onavan Desert. It's the classic Gerudo Desert type thing. You can't see, and you have to follow these cables that lead you to the next beacon. The battle music has changed here. Now it's this really intense track. But honestly, it sounds like it's for an event boss or something that's more than a random encounter. I really preferred the slower song from before. It's actually probably the only battle track that I don't really like in the game. It's just a bit too repetitive for me, and I ended up kind of treating it as just white noise in the background instead of an exciting melody to play while I'm in a fight. The enemies here are giving out status effects like candy, but with Cinnamon healing everybody after every turn, it's easy to just tank. Soon enough, X and the gang run into Ferrum, one of the big 3 Epsilon lackeys from the start of the game. This to me is just such a weird setup for a cutscene. X is stuck in the quicksand and can't get out. I sort of get what they're doing here. Zero doesn't want to let go after Spider, but they end up just falling into the quicksand and it doesn't matter. And this whole time, Ferrum just stands there whipping them a bit and then leaves, assuming that they're dead. She could have just killed them there, but of course for plot contrivancy, she doesn't. Don't let go for Spider, I guess. They all end up in the base through a hole in the ceiling somehow anyway.
Let's do it! For Spider!
You're looking around for a few buttons to open some doors. When you've got the doors open, you get some goodies, but then you have to backtrack. You don't even really get that much good stuff from the item boxes. One thing I'd just like to note here is that dashing is what you use to open items. Having a secondary use for the dash, I think, is something that is worth applauding. The last set of puzzles here involves powering up these switches with these lasers. I sort of got lost here because on my first time entering, I didn't even notice that you could interact with the laser deflectors. The puzzles aren't really anything special, but I actually sort of miss these things in JRPGs. Puzzles feel like they don't appear as often as they used to in the genre, usually replaced by bonus dialogue segments or other things meant to keep people from bouncing off the game. I think that puzzles in RPGs serve as walls to some players, but good simple puzzles can break up the monotony of constant battles. The boss here is Botos, a big round fella and the second of the Epsilon cadres. Botos can definitely be a hard fight.
I'll crush you feeble hunters to pieces!
I wasn't really prepared for a summoner type boss, and my X and Zero were made for single targets. I struggled and lost on the first try and went into it a second time with a better understanding. I knew I needed some attacks that hit multiple targets. I tried using this new weapon that Marino got that hit all enemies at once, but it didn't do enough damage.
How could this happen?
I ended up having to leave to get some more supplies at the hub to make it a bit more manageable. Despite getting set up, the fight is still pretty brutal. His minions can heal him by several turns worth of damage, not to mention he can snowball with just a few of his full team buffs. Basically what I had to do was stack up Axel's medals in order to spam his transformation into Silverhorn as much as possible. Silverhorn's attack is water type, which is good against Botos and his summons, and it hits everybody at once. Meaning that if I could get enough damage on one of the summons, I could do a final strike on them and get 25%, so that the next turn I could do it all over again. Even still, it was pretty tough to get through. After a whole bunch of furious password entering, the strategy finally worked out, and I was left with a newfound appreciation of Axel. All in all, this boss took me a few hours to get past. Botos leaves behind some Super Force metal on his way out. Super Force metal is something that Shadow mentioned earlier, and it's a enhanced force metal that can really boost the power of Reploids. For some reason, Zero almost has him, but he's like, nah, you can walk in the teleporter and get away, that's fine. It's like I said, the number one failure of the story here is the delivery. With that said, Chapter 7 is done. Let's hope that that's the last big difficulty spike. After the last boss was so tough, I had a lot of shopping to do. I was running low on cash, and I just hawked all of Spider's old stuff. It's not like he'll be using it. Moving on, the next area is a frozen factory. It reminds me a bit of the Flame Mammoth stage after you beat Chill Penguin. Once you enter the level, you find yourself casing the place through these peepholes. The professor back at the base is on the radio and realizes it's a missile. It's safe to say we're getting towards the endgame here. Combat has started to recycle a lot of enemies, but some of the more interesting equipment is showing up. I gave Axel this generator weapon that gives him an extra 20% of energy each turn, meaning that he can pretty much do his summon ability every turn. As far as I know, the action trigger damage from Axel doesn't go down if you're using more or less energy, it only gives you more time. The generator sub-weapon is probably good on basically anybody, but you can only get one, so you have to decide on who you think will get the most mileage out of it. My main strategy at this point, and through the rest of the game, was this. Cinnamon is always in play. She was given extra resistance and immunity to electric damage, plus additional weapon energy charging to get a heal out pretty much every turn. I usually had her equipped with these drill arms, because they're the lightest weapon that she had. The more turns she has means that there's less time between healing. Axel was set up to have an extra 10% weapon energy every turn, meaning he would get 35% a turn plus 20% from the generator, bringing him over 50% a turn. I wasn't really using his standard attack nearly as much, so having 2 hits wasn't a big deal, and I chose the weapons that would have the most damage. He had a power charge sub-weapon which multiplies his base damage to make up for any damage loss that he has when he couldn't use his action trigger. Zero just gets better and better every chapter. Black Zero with the combo actions is already incredibly broken, but now he has the Hawkeye sub-weapon, which makes it so that he can't miss flying enemies anymore. It only costed 5% weapon energy, so he would pretty much always be doing some level of damage. That, plus a few medals that increase his critical hit rate, mean that when I can get a fully buffed Zero to do his action trigger and actually nail the inputs, he can crush some bosses. X was starting to be my least set up character. X's game plan was to wait for X-Fire to be fully charged and to just go do that. I also gave him some resistance to stat debuffs so that he's always doing at least some level of damage. Other than that, I just gave him the most appropriate element of Buster case by case. I would generally just outfit him with simple missiles. I didn't really understand exactly what he should be doing, but I guess he's meant to be good at everything. Massimo and Marino I didn't really get to use as often. Massimo, as much as I like him, has quietly settled into his role as a tank, using a bait sub-weapon to force enemies on him so that he can proc his counter more often. Generally, he can survive a lot of hits, and he's useful to have alongside Cinnamon since the majority of healing in the game is based on percentages. Marino has honestly been a bit of a write-off since I don't really use her action trigger properly. Besides that, I keep her ready to swap in case we need to steal or analyze anybody. Later into the game, you get an Analyze Force medal that lets you scan enemies and check their weaknesses. So having Marino set up to just swap in, analyze if I need to, and steal items is good enough. Being able to swap in and get 6 turns for free with Quicksilver will also always be useful. Back to the story. The missile is basically a giant crazy bomb, and it's meant to turn everybody into Mavericks with Force Metal. Botos is just here to tell you that, and he and the other bad guys have the keys for the missile. Boss time. Never mind. Turns out he's got copies. You end up chasing Botos around and doing a bit of this shuffle puzzle. I got it right the first time, got it wrong the second time, but whatever. After this, you run into Ferrum, who's the boss of this area. The main trio really made short work of her. She's supposed to have this energy barrier that you have to break, but most of the time, default attacks would crush it, and then Zero would come in and... Ferrum falls down the missile silo, and Botos is down there waiting for her. Turns out that the keys are actually a part of the cadre's physical bodies, and Botos just rips it out of her. But before you know it, Spider shows up. Don't know what that's about. It feels like the chapter is supposed to be over here, but you have to walk over with X in the gang and find Botos' lifeless body in the hangar.
Just what happened here?
With that, Chapter 8 is over. X lets Colonel Redips know about the Superforce medal, but then there's a sudden attack on the base. Hey X, look, I know there's like a lot of problems, but did you bring your bus pass? You gotta take the transit over. Thanks, man. So it turns out that the attack is just Scarface from the Rebellion, and he's looking for a fight. Scarface is actually pretty easy. He happens to be electric type, meaning that he actually did absolutely no damage to Cinnamon, who could just spam her heal every other turn. At the start of the fight, it says that he counters based on the last type you used, so you have to use a bit of a rhythm to get your attackers to handle it. X would have to attack, and then Zero would have to attack, and then X would have to attack. So at the end of the fight, Scarface talks a bit about being a maverick and what he believes in. The idea of becoming a maverick in the X series is a bit weird to think about. In Japan, mavericks are known as irregulars or irregularities, but in America, they're just mavericks. Going maverick in the series both means being corrupted on some physical level, like from a virus, but it also means just doing crime in general. In a way, mavericks are just like thought criminals. It's no wonder that the mavericks constantly try to start an uprising. They're conscious beings and are being taken away at the first sign of disobedience toward the humans that remain in the world. If you think about it too long, X is like a future cop that punishes people that could just be sick. But we like X. He fights for peace and stuff, right? All later generation Reploids, like Axel, are immune to viruses, meaning that most of the Reploids in Command Mission should also be immune. So they couldn't go Maverick unless deciding to commit a crime. But Axel, X, and Zero are Maverick hunters, meaning that they and their superiors get to decide who and who isn't a Maverick. The overly convoluted philosophy of the X series, despite going into some darker topics, is something that maybe isn't worth looking too far into, probably for a good reason. Since we're pretty much at the end of the game here, I went back to the Sky Room to check out the stuff that I've unlocked. There are so many things to unlock here, from the figures to the posters to the concept art. At least now I have a few to look through. I was hoping I'd have unlocked another scarf color for X, but the yellow one doesn't show up until you go through 500 battles, which is close to double of what I'm currently at. You can also get a purple scarf, but that takes getting everything else in the Sky Room, and that's just not happening anytime soon. I settled on going back to red, since it's the default color. Off we go to the final level, the Grave Ruins base. You might expect something really out there, but this dungeon's nothing crazy. There are some puzzles involving clearing security in the right order, but it's mostly just a lot of fighting. At this point, Axel had become a wave-clearing monster. In the first area, I've barely had to use anybody else. I just go AABA AXY, and it just kills whatever I need to kill. It helps that his current weapon is strong against the only enemies here, the Rebellion Prions.
Ha! Epsilon! It's game over for your plans and your rebellion!
Scarface returns right at the end for a rematch. It's pretty easygoing. It felt like he was the most wasted character of the whole bunch, with some good ideas and a cool enough design, but there's really just not enough time left in the game to do anything here. Instead, we got more Botos.
Glory to the rebellion!
Now it's the final fight, Epsilon himself. Classic Sky Arena, he rips off his old coat and reveals his unfinished body, which is hinted at from the very beginning. He can grab you and set you down to 1 health, so you have to watch out, unless he just does that again and he doesn't kill you.
This can't be!
It was a long fight and Cinnamon was down at the end, so she ended up missing on a few levels. X blows Epsilon away and the mission is complete. Good guys win. Redops arrives just in time to secure the Super Force medal and schedules a ship to pick up X and the gang back at base. It was over.
Thank you, sir.
Look, I obviously know what's coming, and if you've played the game already, you do too. So I'm gonna go to the shops and get set up. Once X shows up to the helipad in the central tower, a bunch of ships arrive.
What?
Poor guy never stood a chance. Good thing Massimo was standing a foot away, because we need that guy. So it looks like Redops was in on this whole time. He declares X a traitor along with the rest of the crew, and destroys the entire base. X and the rest of the team manage to escape and find their way back to the HQ, where Redops is. And now we're really in the endgame. The first hallway you're in when you enter this area is really cool because it reminds me of the first level in Mega Man X, which is probably what it's modeled after. The outside of this tube feels like it's calling out. I wish that you could have gone out of this area and seen what's on the outside. The narrow corridors that make up the majority of this game really don't sell the scale of the world. In true Mega Man fashion, you have a series of boss rematches to face. But before that, you do have to deal with the occasional enemy encounter. The cool thing is, a lot of these enemies are directly from the first few X games, further implying that you're back in the area from the first game. These green guys can go away though. They have these dumb barriers that reset basically every turn, like an even worse version of those Meteors from before. If I needed to grind for XP here, I probably would have just ran away from every fight, including these guys.
You have a death wish? Yeah.
As I go through the bosses again, I want to talk a bit about party balance in Command Mission. When I first played the game, I was under the impression that X, Zero, and Axel were by far the best characters in the game. And returning to this, I really wanted to make an effort to use the rest of the team a bit more. Though I'm pretty sure that they are the better half of the team, I really don't know if you couldn't use the other party members at all. Cinnamon, of course, is great, constantly keeping the team up and sort of just never dying somehow. But Marino and Massimo, even though I couldn't find time to always use them, still feel like you could beat the game using at least one of them the whole way through.
You'll never beat my evolved form!
It is a short game for an RPG. I'm about 18 to 20 hours in at this point, and maybe on another run, I could really commit to the Massimo life. In order to prove to myself that they were viable, I took out Incentis with none of the main trio, just Cinnamon, Massimo, and Marino. And honestly, the fight went pretty well. So yeah, the game is heavily biased towards you using X and Zero, and maybe Axel too, but you really can't sleep on the rest of the Command Mission crew. I thought we were almost at the end of the line on the way to Redops, but we had to deal with this fish guy, Death Dragoon. This guy was honestly a cakewalk.
That really hurt!
Death Dragoon is a dork, but I kinda love it. X doesn't even seem to treat him that seriously, and he just shows up right at the end with this silly face. It's possible that he was meant to be more of an important boss, but it could also be that the developers just wanted a classic Sigma stage mini-boss. I'm not really sure, but now we're on to the real last fight.
I am the ruler of all Reploids.
You're what?
Redops is a tough boss. His little shrimp guys can take away a lot of your turns, and he can inflict Crash, which is an instant kill status effect. I had to go through basically everybody's hyper modes. Massimo at some point had a new bar for his action trigger. I looked it up afterward, and you can get that by doing 3000 damage in one hit with Massimo. Considering the big 8000s that X and Zero have been doing, it's a bit sad for the big guy. The fight itself isn't the most interesting part though, it's the big reveal afterward.
Blast! What were we fighting for?
For your new ruler.
No! We lost Art and Spider for this lousy creep!
Ah, Spider.
What? This can't be real!
My ears are burning. You talking about me?
So you found out that your military superior was falsely pretending to be your team's charming scoundrel. I can't say that the Spider plot twist didn't come from left field, but they heavily hint at it throughout the game. Spider from the very beginning says that he's got his own goals, and then he covers with his goal to deal with the rebels. You never really speak to Redips at the same time as Spider either.
Spider, where have you been?
I've been around.
Redips is constantly leading the players to the next important location without Spider around. And Spider suddenly has to sacrifice himself the moment he hears about the Super Force medal. I'm not saying that this is genius level mega brain writing, but it's a lot more fun than just a military guy who is greedy and mean, or even worse, just Sigma again. What is smart about it is that you can think about it on a bit of a higher level. Knowing that Redips has the same copy ability that Axel does, you can assume that at some point there was a real Spider. Axel has to defeat Reploids to gain their power. It's a gameplay mechanic at first, but it would also mean that the real Spider could have died before the game started. The real Spider probably did know Aile and lived in Giga City, but Aile died too soon to even mention it to the resistance that X formed afterward. Not to mention, Axel and Spider both have the same hyper mode, showing that they're cut from the same cloth. The original Spider could have died just after meeting X as well, since Redips may not have known who Aile was at all. Who knows, this interview I mentioned before suggests that Aile could have not been real at all, and could have been Redips too. It shows to me that the people working on the plot of Command Mission really did put some effort here, to try and tell an interesting story in the Mega Man X universe. Anyways, Spider was Redips, Redips is Spider backwards. Let's move on to the actual final boss. Redips, like everybody else, has escaped through a teleporter, but this one took him out to space. X and the crew chase him down. I love how gruesome Redips' transformation seems to be. He can't even move his face anymore. He's just immobilized in this giant throne that transforms him into Great Redips, the last boss. His final form is great. Good old JRPG God fight vibes, with the Mega Man twist. And he's just grown absolutely massive. Anatomically, the majority of his body is coming out of his neck, with whatever's left of his spine hanging below him. It's pretty nasty stuff. He's got these two force medals strapped to his shoulders. At first, you can't even do anything to damage him. But Ferrum shows up and rips off one of the sides, letting you get to work. From this point on, Redips becomes a straightforward boss. Take out the force medal on its side, and then go to town with Black Zero and X Fire.
Go down!
I threw Quicksilver Marino in there for good measure, and Massimo came in for the ending, to take the last hit. I think the first phase of Redips' fight was meant to be the harder one, and this one is just for the spectacle of it.
Absolutely impossible!
In the end, he's a dead man, and Ferrum decides to drift out into space with the Super Force medal, leaving nothing behind but a fireball heading back to Earth, with X on it. The team jumps into an emergency hatch and falls back to the Earth. I don't know why, but this ending just really took me back. These guys being stranded out in the middle of nowhere at the end felt like a bittersweet end to X's adventures here. There is a bit of a post-game here, and we can go into that a little bit. A number of post-game bosses show up after you beat the game, like Ninetales. To get to Ninetales, you have to beat Tails 1 through 8 in a secret area in the central tower. I got my whole party wiped out by just one tail, so I don't think I'm gonna get into that. I'm not really a crazy post-game guy when it comes to RPGs. Something about hitting those credits really turns off my drive and motivation to break down a game's mechanics. Without even just a shred of story, I tend to just move on. But what I do have is an old save data with most of these things already completed. After you beat some of the post-game bosses, X and Zero get special armors as hyper modes that are unique to Command Mission. X gets the ultimate armor, a complete tank of a suit that can launch multiple missiles with its action trigger. And Zero gets the Absolute Zero armor, a demonic cyber Dracula thing. When you use Absolute Zero's action trigger, you complete inputs to do slashing attacks, one at a time. They're both really awesome rewards, and great for people who decide to defeat the remaining bosses. So that was Mega Man X Command Mission. This game has always been something special to me. For one reason or another, it sits in the back of my mind with its earwormy music and cheesy voice lines. I think it's sad that the series never came back to this whole RPG thing and tried it out again. The cast of Command Mission haven't seen the light of day other than as gacha fodder in a few Capcom mobile games. And Command Mission was the second last Mega Man X game that we ever got, but the small, memorable cast here are all wonderfully designed characters that I think should have had another chance. The story of Command Mission was also a really missed opportunity. It's not the most complex narrative you've ever seen, but it has some emotional beats and fun personalities that could have been expanded on. But it just wasn't given the time and budget that it needed. The gameplay is quite simple in the long run. But with a sequel or something, could have been expanded into an interesting action-y turn-based RPG. In the end, Command Mission is a solid game and a true hidden gem that's stuck back on the GameCube and PS2. For whatever reason, the Mega Man X Legacy Collection held Command Mission back, which is, in my opinion, an RPG that all fans of the X series should definitely have access to. I've had a lot of fun working on this massive video, but I don't think I'll be doing any deep dives on this scale for quite a while. I do hope you enjoyed it though. If somehow you stuck around all the way here, thank you so much for watching this one and sticking around. I hope you decide to like the video and subscribe for more. Once again, thank you and take care.